Okay, we're recording. So, welcome to our Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. We can call this the first talk in our autumn series. This is something like our 25th or 26th talk. Since the last wave of the coronavirus hit us, and here in the UK we seem to be starting to experience a second wave. But either way, this was an initiative given the coronavirus pandemic, which stopped us from meeting physically, but has enabled us to meet virtually, and so we've been meeting on a weekly basis now for more than 6 months with a whole range of presenters. It's been a pleasure to host these sessions every week. We've had folks from all around the world, California to Japan, all across Europe and the States. But today's speaker is quite close to where I hail from, in the northwest or north of England. We've got Dane McCarrick, who is a psychologist, so he's on foreign territory. He worries a little bit about his terminology, so if anybody does have any questions, we can try and on the terminology used, because often we're separated by a common language in different fields and within academia. Then please do get in touch. But Dane McCarrick is one of the co-authors of a paper looking at home advantage during the Covid-19 pandemic, analysis of the European soccer leagues. A few others have also looked at this intriguing phenomena, the effect of all these football matches and sports events taking place without fans over the past few months. So we're really pleased that, Dane, that you're going to present your work, and feel free to share your slides and take your talk away.
Fantastic. Let's get this right. Are we good? Can we see my slides? Is that right?
Yep.
Happy days, great. Well, first and foremost, thanks very much for having me, James. Much appreciated. And as I say, if anyone doesn't understand, first and foremost, my accent, I'm coming from the northeast of England. Tell me to slow down. And second, as I say, I'm a psychologist by trade. I'm a PhD student. Coming from the University of Leeds. So if anything doesn't make sense at any point, please feel free to stop me. I can't see the chat, so if you have any questions, try and keep them until the end, or raise a hand and I'll see if I can stop. I'll go from there. Great. So yeah, a little bit about me. As I said, I'm a PhD researcher in principally health and stress psychology. So my PhD looks at negative mental health, something called preservative cognition, which is a fancy term for worry and rumination, and how those kind of things map onto our health outcomes, whether through health behaviours such as sleep or dietary choices, or whether physical health outcomes such as the common cold, or most recently coronavirus. But a lot of the work that I've done historically has been within this field of sports psychology. So I've looked at referees in particular, which we'll touch on a bit later, which are always a fun topic to discuss. And I've looked at the height of referees, the physical height, and how that maps onto the punitive decision making in the form of yellow cards and red cards and whatnot. And I've also looked at some work on their personality characteristics. And the reason I do this is because my sins, depending on who you ask, I'm an active football referee within the semi-professional, professional game within England. I primarily work in the National League, also some Step 3 leagues, and Middlesbrough. So not great being a Middlesbrough fan at the moment. Doesn't look like the best season ahead, but yeah. But before I kind of dive into the whole home advantage thing, because I'm kind of conscious I probably won't take the full hour, and I'd like to have as much time for questions as possible, I'd like to share a video, which is something that is shown to all the referees at what's known as the PGMO conference, the PGMO organisation that look after all professional referees in England. And if I can share this video, hopefully it will be of interest to you all. Hopefully the sound will work. And if he does that, that'd be fantastic. But if you can just give me a shout if we're struggling for whatever reason.
So we're getting no sound, Dane, but we can see it.
Maybe I'm going through a drought. You don't even have to do too much. You can turn me on with just a touch, baby. I look around, since city's cold and empty, no one's around to judge me. I can see clearly when you're gone. What a hit! Oh, what a hit! Blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this,
similar position on Declan Rice. So close, isn't it? No goal yet. It's been overturned.
I'm running out of time, 'cause I can see the sun light up the sky. So I hit the road in overdrive, baby. Oh,
It comes down to red card decisions. Downgraded to a yellow. Well done.
I can see clearly when you're blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh.
19 takes charge of his 500th Premier League match.
I'm running out of time, 'cause I can see the sun light up the sky. So I hit the road in overdrive, baby. Oh, the city's cold and empty. No one's around to judge me. I can see clearly when you're
Got a lot of ground to cover.
on.
He is coming in too badly.
The coronavirus pandemic opened up a new front today with more of the world's biggest sporting contests cancelled.
To be taken, and it was unanimously decided in the last couple of hours that all matches would be suspended until the 4th of April.
Countdown is on, and the race is on.
Before we kick off, a united front against racism.
This has come through to Raheem Sterling. It's Manchester City who blast out of lockdown.
some welcome scenes, no doubt, there for any Leeds United. Okay, hopefully that's streamed okay, and that wasn't too much lag or anything. But the reason I kind of showed that video is to, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here to some extent, to show the worldwide appeal of football, and in particular to demonstrate its multifactorial consequences, which go well beyond the stadium, which is housed, really. So I hope you find that of interest, and not least the talk from home advantage. Hopefully, add some perspective on the role that referees play in the game, which isn't always showed in the most positive light, but just to show that ultimately we are football fans as well, and we do have a keen interest in that. So, anyway, moving on. The home advantage, the whole talk. Hopefully, this will take around about 35-40 minutes, and then we can have some questions. So, for those that aren't familiar, home advantage is a quite robust phenomenon now in sport, which has been widely recognised over many years. And so, bookmakers, when they're setting the odds, traditionally place emphasis on where the competition taking place, and media reports often comment on the venues which games are going to be played at. And while the causal mechanisms aren't fully clear, which is cited by Pollard in one of the key reviews, the essence is that the driving factor is often warm crowd, supportive, that boost morale and boost performance, and that in turn impacts players and sometimes impacts the referees. But it's important to remember that there are a wide variety of variables that probably influence this relationship too. For some reason my slide isn't. Oh, there we go. So yeah, the very early research on the paper, the first kind of cited paper on home advantage was by Schwartz and Barksey back in 1977, and he's kind of cited as the first empirical investigation to the extent and the reasons for home advantage. So they suggested that supportive crowds are social representatives of the players and exert an invigorating and motivational influence, which encourages the side to perform well. And they had an extensive data collection period whereby they looked at an American baseball, professional, college level, ice hockey, basketball, across a number of sports, and found that this effect of home advantage, albeit it did differ slightly depending on the sport in which it's played. And it kind of sparked the flaw of research, really, and what research came from then, which is explore this phenomenon of home advantage. So in more recent years, the research is generally kind of to move forward towards other factors that might influence it, such as the stadium in which the games are housed, or the referee, travel effects, territoriality, or psychological factors and tactics. But the key author in the area really is Richard Pollard, and he's written 2 reviews in 2008, and 2012, and his most recent work tends to look at the psychological factors and the tactics that teams may employ. So, for example, a lot of the grounds that you go to now in professional leagues, you can visit the away team changing room, and it will be very dark. There'll be low lighting, and it won't be possible to see all of your teammates. Whereas at the home team dressing room, they'll have music on, and they tend to try and make it as daunting as possible for the away team. It's all about having this territoriality there and trying to make sure that you have as much advantage as possible. But in recent years, a bit of research has been done on that. And also around the role of referee. So there's quite a broad body of evidence now suggesting that referees are susceptible to social influence, which should point out referees are human, and as humans are subject to social influence, it shouldn't therefore be surprising that referees may well be at all. But the key argument is that referees may unknowingly rely on social cues when making the decisions because we have a difficult job. and that in turn impacts our decision making. Note the point here is decision making, not decision making accuracy. And so no study, at least to my knowledge, has looked at the accuracy of yellow and red cards or decisions given by referees, but more just the normative data of yellow and red cards given by referees. And this actually extends to penalty kicks as well, which, as we know, has a profound impact on game outcomes, particularly in African countries. So it's important to say that at some level, referees are implicated in home advantage. But the evidence thus far has overlooked a wide variety of moderators, such as the quality of teams, the strength of the opposition, and the dominance particularly of teams, such as their attacking tendencies, their possession, how many free kicks they have, and maybe it's the wider impact of the game on the predicting finishing position of the team. And so it's important to kind of consider these factors. It's also been overlooked and omitted in the empirical literature in terms of the relative effective crowd size. So what happens when games are played at reduced capacity? And what might happen if you stagnate attendances, which of course is not really going to happen naturalistically, as that has financial implications for teams. And when home advantage is such a well talked about phenomenon, teams obviously want as much support as they possibly can from the fans. And so while it might be interesting empirically and scientifically to look at this, in the real world, it was never going to happen. Until home advantage and the Covid-19 studies that have recently been published took advantage of this. And so to anyone who, and I know this might be stating the obvious by this point, but to anyone who is start thinking, well, how are home advantage and Covid-19 related? It's not the virus itself, it's the circumstances that came about from Covid-19 that have impacted our behaviour, and one of which not being able to attend football games. So we have this opportunity to observe this naturalistic manipulation, where we can observe games played with an audience at an elite level and across multiple countries. And I suppose as a psychologist, I'm always interested, we're interested in looking at how changes in X variable relates to changes in Y. But there's always circumstances preventing this, whether that's ethically or logistically. So when it occurs naturally like this, it kind of struck me as an opportunity to take note. So, based on all of the games that have taken place in this pre-COVID period, and I'll get into the methodological details in a moment, what were we predicting, what were we getting at? So, in essence, based on everything we know about home advantage and that it influences the crowd and the referee, we thought that home advantage would be reduced within the final quarter of games played without a crowd, about 25% across Europe, and that it would impact referees' decision making too. So the data hunt was actually quite broad, and what's really interesting a lot of these home advantage studies is they tend to use different data sources. I mean, James has spoke about this on the trial run of this, and how there's such a lot of research coming out now that is finding similar findings, but is taking their data from different sources. And I think that's why we're seeing a wider variety of variables within the papers that are being released. But at least I can only speak for our paper. We analysed data from 15 leagues spanning 11 countries, which are all noted there. And the key thing is that around about 27% were played without an audience, whereas 72% were. And this was we pre-registered this on the Open Science Framework. If people aren't familiar with that, I don't know if that's you do econometrics, but we tend to try and pre-register things before we do analyses and make sure they're open and replicable. And I'm all personally for the personal view of mine is that we should try to do this where possible and be open about our scientific practice. So the variables, you can kind of think about these in three broad categories. So the general way to measure home advantage historically is look at goals scored and the final points. But we also looked at shots for each team, shots on target, corners, fouls conceded, and those are the kind of general team variables. And then the referees variables are obviously the fouls, the yellow cards, and red cards. Anyone who doesn't know, that might be useful for you to know. Usually referees give around about, depending on the league, around about anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500 fouls in any given weekend. But then if you compare that to, that would be across a broad range of fixtures. Within a game, referees tend to give out 40, 50 fouls, depending on the game and the intensity and whatnot. Compare that to yellow cards. So my game 2 weeks ago, I think I gave 32 fouls. I gave 2 yellow cards and no reds. And so it's the point I'm getting at is fouls are awarded on a punitive basis, and they can be for very minor offences, whereas yellow cards are a further step up, and a red card would be even more so a further step up. For example, last season I had 4 red cards in a whole season, whereas I'd have usually more than 4 yellow cards in a game. And finally, the team rating variables. This is something to try and account for those moderators I just touched on, to look at the relative impact of the team's position within the league, and also the importance of the match. But because these games will take place at the end of the season, and there are different consequences because teams are under more pressure to be promoted or relegated or whatnot, and we trying to account for those in our analyses. Speaking of which, we use something called multi-level modelling. I'm sure the statisticians may well be familiar with this, but just thinking James we're trying to bridge the gap between terminology yesterday. And from my understanding, all they essentially are all motion models are the hierarchical regression models with various levels of analyses nested within each other. So the way that we looked at it, we had individual matches played home and away, nested within individual themes. We then examined the venue, which would be home and away, which would be binary, and the COVID period, again, home and away, which is binary outcome, and it more importantly, their interaction. We would then insert the covariates of the strength of the individual teams based on where they were positioned in the league, do account for the schedule bias, and then insert it within levels of country or decision making, countries or divisions, on each dependent variable for the team data, which was games won, points, and goals scored, which is of course a Poisson distribution. And finally, we were interested in dominance, and because of issues with the distribution, we used Poisson distributions as an alternative. So it's important to remember that the ratings for importance of the games and for dominance were on a range of 0 to 100, so they were both equivalent in that terms. And so because of that, we were able to compare them not only within a single league, but also across leagues. And for the referee data, again, same multi-level modelling approach, Poisson distribution, with the same covariates as previously discussed, nested within country and division. But one thing we want to look at for the referee data, which hadn't really been looked at too much at all, I don't think, before, was the dominance. So it might make sense that the more dominant a team is, the more it's probably likely to get fouled from a different team because they're trying to fend off their attacking tactics. So we wanted to control for this. So the results. So the descriptive results for the team performance is that teams won on average nearly 0.4 points per game at home than away, but this was almost halved when the fans were not present, which is quite a large effect. And the home team, in terms of goals, scored 0.29, whereas when the crowd wasn't there, that was reduced to 0.15. So you kind of see these large effects that the audiences perhaps have on teams, which they don't anymore once they're removed. But one thing that was fascinating to me as a referee during games, you do often feel sometimes that the pressure from the defending team, they're under a lot of pressure. They're under the caution, trying to defend, trying to to put in full tactics to try and stay in the game. And you do find, as I've said, that they might tend to foul people more in order to do so. There's this dominance measure, and the home team's dominance, which was measured by the standardized factor of the corner, the shots and the shots on target, was actually a lot smaller. And the away teams, in contrast, were closer to the performance of the pre-COVID period in front of fans. And so when you actually look at the dominance in the away teams, it only improved 0.05 of the standard deviation, which means that the decrease from a home team perspective in some of these parameters is actually more than tenfold, to the extent of the away team, which is quite accurately depicted in the dominance graph below. The dominance is a real key factor here. So then we look at the formal regression models from this, and the way you kind of need to look at is the interaction between venue with the away period and the COVID post period. And these confirmed our descriptive statistics. So these are, as I said, in essence, hierarchical regression, fixed effect models with dummy variables entered more than once at the same level. So, for example, you'd have COVID period and country division and team, and then a standard, you just see which one explains more variance, taking one out at a time. So the effect of home advantage is not driven by the difference in the schedule or the difference of importance between home and away teams in the pre-post COVID period. And equally, the stronger teams and the teams with more to play for win more points. But this was constant for both home and away matches. That wasn't significant, as well for the periods without an audience. And the same is true for goals scored. Both ratings of importance and positive predictors of goals scored, but there's no significant interaction between the venue or COVID period. So in other words, the effects of audience and the home advantage is not influenced by the difference in schedules and pre-post COVID periods. And in lay terms, that kind of supports the literature in that home advantage is somewhat a robust phenomenon that perhaps isn't as influenced by these moderators as well as previously thought. So the referee results. Overall, the home advantage is really prominent here, at least by these graphs, as you can see. And just bear with me here. We will go into this a little bit deeper, and I'm very conscious that it's tough as a referee sometimes to kind of see this data and you think, oh, this is, we always taught to be impartial and down the middle, and I've discussed these findings with a few colleagues, and it's really interesting how people react. I'm like, wow, you know, these are these global level differences that occur. So yeah, I'll go into these a little bit further. So overall, the home advantage is again prominent. So overall, the home team received fewer yellow cards and red cards, but this is more pronounced with the audience here. In the post-COVID period, without an audience, there were virtually no differences in the yellow and red cards between home and away teams, with a small difference present for the number of fouls. The away team is actually penalised far less for fouls when the audience was absent, whereas the home team, although fouling more, does receive a similar amount of warnings. And it's kind of the same pattern for red cards, but just less pronounced. But the away team, in essence, received less cards when the game is played without an audience, but the home teams were penalised more than without the support of their home fans. So then when you look at the regression models to kind of confirm this, so the multi-level analyses here follow the same trend, just to reiterate, as the team data in the fouls, yellow and red cards as dependent variables, and venue for home and away are predictors of home advantage. So the interactions between venue and audience were significant for fouls as well as for yellow cards. However, and that's why I say bear with me, given these results, one could think that the presence of fans biases referees' decisions against the visiting team, and that is to some extent true. However, these analyses do not account for the attacking tendencies of teams. So passive teams which are content to defend, as indicated by a low number of shots on goal or corners, or those who tend to foul more and receive more warnings to tend to fend off the team, as we've said, might mean that the referee's decisions are a consequence of this rather than the bias that would be incurred by the referee from the home advantage. So the key thing here to again consider is dominance of teams, as again measured by that standardized latent factor of corners, shots on goals and shots on targets. So when we include dominance within the regression model, the effects are actually diminished, or at least for some variables. So the interaction between venue and covered period is no longer significant for red cards, for example. However, it still does stand for yellow cards and for fouls, but it's weakened, so it's diluted. So it seems that the effect of the audience on referees is most related to the less dominant performance of home teams when they play without the fans. So it seems perhaps that maybe poorer teams rely on the crowd to compensate for the lack of skill, is how I kind of interpret this. But of course, I'm sure a lot of people will be sat there thinking, you can't hide the fact that there is an effect still for fouls and yellow cards, and that's true, and that is consistent with the papers that have been released in recent weeks. But I think we need to consider the factor of dominance. So, what are the key findings? It's that the team performance, our data clearly shows that when controlling for all these moderators, all these factors that we might have thought of before, the country, the league, the schedule, team quality, the effect of playing in a virtually empty stadium has a significant negative impact on the typical home performance, thus supporting our hypotheses. The points for games, the goals per games, and team dominance are all significantly reduced in home teams compared to away teams. And our data also shows a wealth of support for the literature on home advantage. So a lot of the studies that I discussed a few moments ago, we're in concurrence with them. And so we can conclude that the effect of the audience has a relatively strong effect on home advantage. In terms of the referee data, as just to reiterate, our initial data analysis shows that referees were influenced by the absence of an audience, or in actual fact by larger crowds, by penalising the away team less, by awarding fewer yellow and red cards. But this is actually diminished, as I've said, and diluted for some variables. But this is just a thought before we kind of move on and jump to conclusions. One potential factor to consider that we didn't include within our analyses, and in hindsight, maybe we could have, is this idea of a home disadvantage. So one thing to consider is that we're comparing games at the beginning and middle of the season, and those at the end. And so the key outcomes are likely to be different. So the promotion, the relegation, the final placements that go on. And there's actually some archival data out there examined by a group of researchers led by Buemeister and colleagues, and that's looked at this kind of thought process in baseball and basketball. And they actually looked at found the reverse effect, that the home advantage was no longer apparent, because at the end of the season, when these games are more important, the crowd are more likely to get on players back and more likely to have a negative impact on players. But it's also possible, because of that, that the players are more likely to be more frustrated, and it might exacerbate this effect that we're finding. And thus, it might be that we're actually picking up the effects of a home disadvantage here. However, and again, this is just points for a discussion. There's room for debate, and it was also criticised by other colleagues, by Butler in 1998, following these analyses, and they found that performers actually believe that the observers had a helpful effect on the performance, as opposed to a negative one that was discussed before. And so one thing that I'd really like to do, I have this opportunity again. And again, it's in an ideal world because you need to be able to identify willing participants within the game, is to try and delve in to how it's affected the psyche of players and referees, because the data that we've observed are vast and very powerful. But I think a qualitative approach of speaking to some of these individuals, and I know from speaking to some of my colleagues, the impact that working in an environment whereby there's more pressure at the end of the season can actually impact performance adversely. And while those are unofficial and while they're interesting, I think it would be interesting to see if that concurs with players' feelings. And so there's certainly scope for qualitative work in this area, in my view, that would advance current standings. And again, it's important to reiterate that we have lots of confounds, and the removal of the audience coincides with all the training sessions, playing schedules, kickoff times, and which is significant as home advantage has been shown to be sensitive to this. Also time effects, where the games are no longer played on 7:30, 3 o'clock, and they're very inconsistent to try and get all games shown on TV. And also COVID itself, there was some positive tests for other teams in Europe, and from a statistical viewpoint, we obviously have the issue of non-independence. One game might impact another. And again, we examined 25% of games, not 50% of games, and while we were just working with the naturalistic manipulation, it might be more powerful in future directions if we're able to do this. So in essence, what's the story? It's that the audience has a huge effect on advantage as measured by goals and points, and the audience effect is based on the inferior performance of home teams and not really on the improvement of away teams. And on face value, audience has an effect on referees' decisions, as we've said, but this diminished when we look at the factor of dominance, at least in the case of red cards. Issues. One season, snapshot of the data. We didn't fully compare within our paper intercultural differences because of the power issues that we came across. Lots of confounds, but despite our efforts to control for them. And in the referee analyses, we didn't really consider player actions. So at least from the referee literature now, there's this idea of ethnographic studies that might want to look at interrelatable and dyadic relations between players and referees to see if players' behaviour is driving these effects. And an issue that's actually overlooked quite a bit is how many stadiums played crowd noise. So I know that in some championship grounds, despite there being no crowd present, some of the stadiums actually played crowd noise during games, which of course might have influenced results. So finally, where does that leave us? This idea of home advantage, of course, is very popular. It's very topical, and I can certainly say from speaking to my colleagues and those that work higher above me within the refereeing pyramid, it's certainly of interest. But the way that things are going now with COVID, and as a tragedy as it is, one of the research benefits from that is we might be able to look at home advantage a little bit further. So, for example, what is the relative impact of fans? Is there a number needed to constitute home advantage? And I know, speaking to James, he's done work on this, and his paper included some fans that some games which included some fans and some that didn't, and whatnot. But to what extent this might be the case, and to what extent this may fluctuate depending on size, remains to be seen. And so, as we return fans to stadiums, we might end up in a situation whereby we're able to look at 50% capacity. And if that's the case, does that decrease or increase home advantage? And equally, we could also look at the dispersion of crowds. If people are sat apart, if you go watch, as opposed to being sat close together, does that impact the noise that's generated? And does the noise generated by the crowd impact the home advantage? So I hope you found that of interest. I hope that was concise enough, and I'd like to welcome any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Dane. Really, really interesting presentation. There have been no questions put in the chat, so the fact you can't see that is not an issue, and so we can go pretty much straight to inviting questions. And straight away, Peter Dawson has his hand up. So, Peter, do you want to ask a question?
Thanks, James. Thank you, Dave. Huh?
You're at Wembley.
Yeah, I wish. It's empty. It's empty. It's a rugby league game. And that's under normal circumstances as well. Sorry, Dane. That's a very interesting presentation. That was there's some studies in there which I wasn't aware of, but then being an economist, we tend to ignore other disciplines more often than not, and we should obviously avoid doing that too often. I've just got a couple of questions. I might come back. Obviously, I don't want to kind of take up too much of the time in terms of dominating the questions, but I've got one or two to begin with, and I might come back with a few others later if that's all right, James, just depending how the chat goes. So I've done a bit of work in this area as well, probably a little bit behind everyone else in terms of the actual COVID stuff, but I've done some initial analysis on this and roughly back of the envelope calculations. That's the only time I have at the moment, unfortunately. One of the things I did find, and it'd be interesting to see what your thoughts on this are, is you talked about dominance, and you talked about obviously attacking play and shots on target, corners, etc. But if you actually split this up by so-called big teams versus smaller teams, so if you have some kind of objective measure by which you identify what a big team is, based on the quality of the team, the valuation of the team, whatever it might be, one of the things I noticed was that home advantage for the bigger teams actually increased when stadiums were empty. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that, because and it was actually quite a substantial increase as well. I mean, obviously you'd expect a higher home advantage for the bigger teams anyway. But what I found quite surprising was it actually went up, and it went up significantly when the stadiums were empty. So that's my first question, but I'll let you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the question. I think sorry if I wasn't clear. I mean, there's, in my mind, to everyone really, if anything wasn't clear, I do apologise. There's a lot of variables, a lot of things to try and get through, and so to be clear, we did actually look at an objective measure of quality with team ratings, and what we found is in essence what you've said, but we kind of interpret it as opposed to the better teams had a stronger home advantage. If you spin it on its head, even though it's the same effect, it's that the poorer teams have a lesser home advantage. So at least in my mind, that is that the poorer teams kind of rely on the crowd to compensate for their lack of skill. And so maybe if you look at the Premier League, a team like Bournemouth or Villa, for example, and maybe they may have relied on the crowd slightly more than say Manchester United or Liverpool do. And so yes, my finding is in concurrence to yours, but that's how I'd interpret it. If that answers your question.
Yeah, the thing that I found though was that when the big teams were playing at home, their home advantage increased with the absence of a crowd, which I do find quite an unusual outcome.
So you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, so you're saying when say Manchester United or Liverpool, they play at home, their home advantage considerably increases.
Yeah,
from
stadium zone.
Relative to the period in which it's closed, right? Okay. I don't think we looked at individual teams, and I don't think we deciphered our analysis to that level. I think it was a broader overview. So that's something I'd have to look at closer, to be honest. But if that's right, maybe some of the effects were lost in the variety of analyses we ran. I mean, I'd be interested, how many leagues did you look at when you ran these analyses?
So we didn't look at as many leagues as you did. Obviously, even James did. To the top 2 tiers of the 4 dominant leagues in Europe.
Even still, you should maybe have found something along those lines.
One of the thoughts I had with this was whether the bigger teams were able to cope better as a consequence of sport coming back, and obviously the bigger teams having bigger squads, and obviously the quite quick turnaround of obviously matches, and maybe obviously I think something you mentioned in the presentation about some teams were affected by COVID directly. So therefore, that potentially would have had an effect on the playing personnel which were available to them. So there might be an element that it might not necessarily be directly football related, but obviously as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic.
I agree. Certainly, I can speak for myself. I found it very difficult adapting to life post-pandemic, and the more support that you got from that, and I suppose the better teams, as you say, are more equipped to do so. That may have offset some of the home advantage effects that we've observed in the study. Absolutely. I agree.
The other factor that I don't know if you mentioned, Dane, was the 5 substitutions rather than 3. There's another change, and I know that there was an article by Ignacio Huerta, who took with a thought experiment about whether or not that would increase or decrease home advantage, because you imagine that a bigger team has more great players they can bring on, and so therefore they benefit more than a smaller team who their 5th substitute is going to be the ball boy or something.
Yeah, but that's exactly it as well. I think that's one of the things we mentioned in our paper, that that substitution rule has been implemented, which interestingly they're now taking out next season. So perhaps that reflects their view as well, that squad rotation is an important factor. I agree, James.
Peter, do you have any follow-up questions?
Has nobody else got any questions at the moment?
Well, Alex has put one in the chat. So, Dane, Alex, he says that after the closed doors, you've got other factors that may affect performance, different preparation for games. He asks, can you rule out the other potential story that may drive the reduced home advantage?
Yeah, so those kind of things in terms of the potential confounds of play, is what I was getting at towards the end. There's a lot of unmeasured stuff going on here. So while the data is strong in that it captures what we were able to measure, it doesn't account for the difference in preparations that teams may have. For example, I think a lot of because of the travel restrictions, I think a lot of teams were without players at the start. I think stories in the news of I think De Jong was stuck in Amsterdam for a while and he couldn't get back to his team and whatnot. So those kind of naturalistic variations within teams' preparations we obviously couldn't account for. But I suppose, devil's advocate in my mind, I'm thinking, well, those are random effects, random things that have happened, and so surely that's part of the level playing field that is sport, and these things happen, and it's the same for everybody.
Stefan has got his hand up.
Hi there. Yeah, really fascinating stuff. This is such an interesting question, and we clearly need to know the answer to this. So great that you're doing work on it. I just had a puzzle. So one thing that struck me, just looking at England and Germany, in the Bundesliga, it was very clear that the home team advantage was significantly diminished. Just so you look at points per game for the home team, it fell from 1.52 to 1.18 with after COVID, but it doesn't appear to have been true in the Premier League. I calculate the home team points per game were 1.59 before COVID, and actually went up. They're 1.62 after. So, do you have any explanation? I mean, it seems like there's some major cross-country differences that might be here, and what might explain that?
That's a great question. Thanks, Stefan. So, first of all, for our paper, we didn't look at intercultural differences. That's probably the major limitation. For two reasons. One, because we had power issues, and two, because I think a lot of people are working on this. We were keen to try and get the ball moving quickly in terms of getting things out. But in terms of the causality that you're speaking of, so I've been really fortunate to referee abroad, not to an elite level, but to a semi-elite level, and also obviously here. And one thing I would say from my own experience is that English football and the fans that surround it are often extremely more passionate. It's not that you feel intimidated or whatnot, but I would say you're certainly aware of the presence slightly more that they have, which is interesting because the home advantage, as you've said, is probably more profound in Germany. So you would suspect that this would impact referees less here, but again, we've not looked at. We didn't look at the Premier League. We didn't look at that relative impact in Germany, but yeah, I'd say that the difference in the crowd and the difference in perhaps the size of the stadium. I don't know about the size of the stadium in Germany. That's not something I've looked at, but it might be a factor that's at play as well. Because I know there's some evidence to suggest that the structure of stadiums might have a role to play too.
I think one of the things there is certainly the great degree of variation across countries, and that's one thing that we noticed as well when we were looking at it. We've got a couple of basically a plot showing the kind of variation of difference. One of the things, I mean, just to kind of follow up on Stefan's point about Germany, was that a lot of that real home disadvantage, or the strongest effect, I think, was earlier on. So I was calculating it actually yesterday, which is that of the first 55 matches after the resumption, 11 were won by the home teams. So 80% won. In the last couple of game weeks, the home advantage strongly returned, if you like. And so a question would be, I don't know whether you thought about the familiarity effect. So presumably you had this yourself, you're refereeing in this unfamiliar circumstance of no fans, but after a few weeks you probably got a bit more familiar with it, a bit more used to it, and maybe that influenced the way in which you and also the football teams playing without fans, maybe they eventually got used to it. Maybe there's some kind of familiarity effect.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I'd definitely concur with that. And also maybe I don't know this, but it might be a question in terms of the time frame from stopping games to resuming games. Obviously, I think Germany resumed sooner, but I think they actually paused sooner. So maybe it's the time frame in which the teams have had off. If there is certain countries where that's lesser the case, the home advantage might differ there, but I don't know. It's just me thinking aloud. A good question, fantastic question. Yeah, it's an interesting thought.
Any more questions? Peter.
I like the idea of what you said towards the end about whether you could identify a threshold of which home advantage potentially kicks in. And obviously with, well, at least hopefully, an increasing number of games or increasing number of matches where there'll be a limited number of spectators allowed back into stadiums. I mean, what's your kind of, as a match official, what's your best guess then? I mean, obviously, what level? You talked about 50%. You talked about lower levels than that. What would your best guess be in terms of where that kind of home advantage kind of kicks in? I mean, obviously, it's a difficult probably a problematic question because obviously stadiums differ, as you've said, in terms of size and structure, etc. But do you get a sense of a threshold? I mean, do you get a sense that where I live at the moment in Norwich, there'll be 1,000 fans let into a 28,000 seater stadium to watch Norwich against Preston? It's not the most exciting, enthralling type of match. But I mean, do you think that 1,000 fans in a stadium in a stadium of say 30,000 will probably make no difference, or will it make enough difference that it could have an effect?
The honest answer is this morning is when I was finishing the back end of those slides, and the Premier League 2 appointments came out, and I think that can answer your question. If you look over the last 4 or 5 years, the Premier League 2 data, so that's the fringe players, and some players come back from injury. They play in stadiums throughout the season, same as the first team do, but you've only got a fraction of the fans. You've got 1,000, 2,000 stands. If you analyse that data, that will answer your question, I think, to some extent. Granted, it's historical data, it's not here and now like this weekend, but I think that would give you valuable insight. And in terms from a refereeing perspective, I don't know. It's interesting because you speak to some officials and without naming names and grounds, they go, I don't like going there for this reason or that reason. Or, I never have a good game there. Whether that's just superstition or whatnot, it's there. You observe these things, and I find it very interesting as a psychologist why people think and say these things. And yeah, that's why I kind of at the end there kind of touched on the qualitative work, because we kind of have this helicopter view at the moment. But I think speaking to people and understanding the views is very valuable.
Jorge has his hand up.
Hi, really interesting. You mentioned something about this, but I am not sure what you exactly did. I mean, comparing it with the previous season as a control group. So if you get that you had in Germany when after COVID you had, I don't know, 6 match days, and in England you had 8 or 9 more. Maybe comparing with the previous season, using that as control group instead of the previous, of the early part of the season before COVID, would be an interesting exercise, especially if you kind of also control with the situation of each team. You know, you are 4 points from the UEFA position, 3 points from relegation, stuff like that. And maybe that can be a really interesting control group to kind of validate your results, or maybe, you know, you can find something else. I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for the question. To be honest, the intention when we first started looking at this was to actually look at previous seasons. As it always is when you start a research project, to do something different and it changes down the line. But yeah, I agree. I think looking at last year's data cross-culturally is certainly a lens to worthy of merit. My only concern might be that if you look at last season in the Premier League, where you've got full stadiums, and then at the minute whereby we've got this kind of staged return where you're getting some trials in some stadiums and not in others. When you come to do the analyses, I wonder if there'd be enough data, and I think it might take some time before we've actually had this staged return of fans whereby we have enough data and enough fluctuation in the number of fans in stadiums that enables us to make very strong conclusions based on that.
Any further questions? Peter.
Sorry, I'm just taking over, James, in this session.
Right.
Dane, I'd be interested to know about how you felt being a match official. I mean, have you gone back? Have you started officiating again now? And how are things, if at all, have changed for you in terms of how you felt about officiating and how player behaviour has changed, if it's changed at all since you've returned?
So I was quite fortunate to be involved in the playoffs at the end of last season in the National League North. With Altrincham, Chester, and final was Boston as well, and Altrincham. Tough to say. I don't think the players' behaviour has changed an awful lot. They get into this habitual fight or flight state, and ultimately, people give players a hard time for the way they speak to referees. But generally speaking, in my experience, they just want to win. They just want the next point. They just want the next foul. They just want the next decision to be made in their favour, and that's not changed. In my experience of those games that I was involved in last year. My season hasn't started yet. I've got a game this Saturday. But in terms of how you referee the game, the FA have been very, very clear with us. We shouldn't change the way that we officiate, and it's not our responsibility to enforce social distancing and whatnot. But that said, you always have that little kind of thing in the back of your mind, and I'll give you an example of if a challenge goes in as a referee, at least I speak for myself, if a challenge goes in, and you know for certain that if you get in there quickly and move to be proximal to those players and try and calm them down and reassure them and to be there and to be seen, I know that by doing that, I'm going to stop any further misconduct. But to do that, I've got to be close to the players. And so if I do that, I know that at most I'm going to have a caution for one player if it's a cautionable offence, and everything else will stop. Whereas if you kind of look at it from the other side right now, right, I don't want to do that because I'm close to somebody. You might find you get the situation whereby you blow the whistle, you don't move in, you keep your distance from people, and then things flare up, and so you kind of morally don't know where to sit on it, because you want to follow the social distancing requirements, but equally there's certain circumstances in the game, few and far between. Now, this is a certain example, whereby being close to players is important. So it's tough. It's really tough. Maybe this time next year I'll be able to answer your question better.
So were you actively encouraged to stay 1.5 meters, 2 meters from players? Is that what you were?
Yeah, we'd be given the same COVID guidance as everybody else, really. I must say on record, to be fair, that the support that we've had from the FA and from the PGMOL and all the clubs that we officiate, we get a comprehensive guidance and action plans and everything. And so, we're much like the players, we're very well supported. It's just much like everybody really in any walk of life. I think we all have a degree of social responsibility. It's just tough when sometimes that might overlap with your duties as a new job.
Any more questions? One thing I will say. Oh no, is that a question coming in? Just some interference. One thing I was going to say was Alex had a question there, and you mentioned the potential impact of different kickoff times. Obviously, now we've got these staggered kickoff times, even games at 5:30 and 6 on weekday evenings. Alex has written a paper, and perhaps he might be able to say better than me on this. But I think, Alex, you found that there was a stronger home advantage in unusual kickoff times. I think it was Europa League matches when they brought in the earlier games. But maybe it was stronger for the away, for the stronger teams, the effect. Maybe Alex is going to.
Is he here?
I think he may have gone. I don't see his initial. Alex Krumer, looking at Europa League matches and the home advantage for teams that play at unusual kickoff times.
As he said, Alex kindly emailed me before the presentation and sent me some papers from it, and I must have not got round to reading them all, but I looked at the first two, and I think what you're saying is right. The effects are more pronounced with the away side. It's interesting.
He's already said newspaper. That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it looks like there's no more questions.
Can I ask before you kind of wrap up?
Yeah.
Did you, from an outside perspective, how did you think about the video at the start? Is that something you kind of exposed to before, and or you think it was interesting? Or
I mean, I think it's fascinating because, as you say, it's something that referees are shown. Presumably, that's being shown to referees, obviously post-COVID. But I think it's, these are the kinds of insights that I think are really interesting because, well, none of us, we're also economists and not psychologists, but we're also not referees either. So these are really quite interesting insights. I think in terms of thinking about the way in which a referee approaches the game. That's one of the things that you bring to your research project, as well as when you're talking in a context of economists. Here, you also bring the psychology perspective as well. One of the things I noticed was that you referred to. So we call it a natural experiment. Is how we'd refer to this. I think you call it naturalistic manipulation, was it, or something?
Yeah. yeah.
So we're separated by a common language. But just in terms, I mean, I'm just going to wrap up and then we'll switch off the recording. But just to thank you, Dane, for a really interesting presentation. Thank all of the participants who took part. And what I'll do before finishing is flag up that next week we also have another presentation on a similar topic. We have Justice Haukapp from the Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics, taking a German perspective. Does crowd support drive the home advantage in professional soccer? Evidence from the German ghost games during the COVID-19 pandemic. So please do join us same time next week if you can.